What if the most powerful figure in this story isn't the one everyone is talking about? What if the real influence doesn't appear in court documents, headlines, or even documentaries, but exists quietly behind them? Over the past year, the public has been flooded with investigations, exposés, and so-called uncensored documentaries. Yet despite all the footage, interviews, and insider accounts, a strange pattern keeps emerging. When the conversation gets too close to certain power centers, it suddenly stops. Segments are shortened. Names disappear. Questions are raised, and then never answered. This has led many observers to wonder whether what we're seeing is the full story, or a carefully contained version of it. Because when multiple investigations point in the same direction, and then stop, it forces one uncomfortable question: is Diddy the center of this story, or simply the boundary we're not meant to cross? To understand why so many questions still linger, we first need to look at what didn't make it into the final versions of recent documentaries, interviews, and public discussions. On the surface, several high-profile projects appeared bold and revealing. They featured insiders, archival footage, and long-form storytelling that suggested unprecedented access. Viewers were led to believe they were finally seeing behind the curtain. Yet as many analysts later pointed out, these projects shared a striking similarity: moments of build-up without full resolution. According to multiple media observers, entire segments were shortened or removed late in production. Interviews that were teased in early promotional materials either appeared in heavily edited form or never appeared at all. In some cases, individuals referenced in trailers or early reporting were later absent from the final cut, without explanation. This is where questions began to form. Several commentators noted that early versions of these projects reportedly included broader context, not direct accusations, but background information that expanded the scope beyond one individual. That context, according to reports, focused on systems rather than personalities. Networks of influence rather than isolated behavior. And notably, those portions are what seem to be missing. Instead, the narrative became narrower. Rather than examining how power structures function, how protection mechanisms operate, or how influence moves across industries, the final edits often returned to a single focal point. This led many to wonder whether the story was being simplified, not for clarity, but for containment. Even more curious were references to material that allegedly exists but remains unreleased. According to interviews and social media statements, there were mentions of unused footage, extended conversations, and additional documentation that never reached the public. In some cases, creators themselves hinted that certain material was not cleared, not approved, or not the right time. Importantly, no official explanations were given for most of these omissions. What's notable is that these removals didn't involve sensational claims or explicit allegations. Instead, they reportedly centered on relationships, timelines, and connections, the kind of information that doesn't accuse, but contextualizes. The kind that invites viewers to think more broadly. And when that context disappears, the story changes. Several independent journalists pointed out that when investigative projects consistently stop short of naming systems or examining overlapping power circles, it creates an illusion of exposure while preserving ambiguity. Viewers feel informed, but still sense something unresolved. This pattern becomes more striking when multiple projects, produced independently, arrive at similar editorial boundaries. It's also worth noting that this isn't unusual in media history. Investigative reporting often faces legal, financial, and institutional pressures. Editors must consider risk, access, and sustainability. These realities don't imply wrongdoing, but they do shape what reaches the screen. As a result, what the audience receives is not necessarily false, but incomplete. And that incompleteness is where speculation grows. Because when footage exists but isn't shown, when interviews are recorded but not aired, and when narratives narrow just as they approach broader systems, people naturally begin to ask why. Not what was said, but what was left out. And more importantly, who benefits from those omissions remaining invisible? Once the missing material is acknowledged, the next step is to look for patterns, not conclusions, but repetitions that appear across time, platforms, and industries. One of the most consistent patterns noted by media analysts is selective visibility. Certain figures remain central in public narratives, while others, often more powerful, less public-facing, appear only at the edges, if at all. Their names surface briefly, then disappear. Their influence is implied, not explored. This has led some observers to compare multiple cases across entertainment, tech, and media, noting how stories tend to follow a familiar structure. A controversy emerges. A focal individual absorbs attention. Public discussion intensifies. Then, gradually, the conversation stabilizes without fully expanding outward. In these moments, attention rarely shifts toward systems. Instead of asking how influence is maintained, the focus stays on who is currently visible. Instead of examining overlapping relationships, the narrative isolates events. This approach isn't unique to one documentary or one industry, it appears repeatedly. According to long-form reporting specialists, this narrowing often coincides with moments when stories approach shared interests, business partnerships, platform dependencies, or reputational risk that spans more than one sector. Another recurring pattern involves timing. In several high-profile cases, material that could broaden context appears just as public interest peaks, then is delayed, edited, or reframed. Statements are released. Teasers circulate. Expectations rise. But when the final product arrives, it stops just short of connecting the dots. This has led many to wonder whether the timing itself serves a function, not to reveal everything at once, but to manage how information enters public consciousness. There's also the pattern of who speaks, and who doesn't. Some individuals are consistently vocal, willing to hint at deeper issues without fully detailing them. Others remain notably silent, even when their proximity to events would suggest insight. Silence, in this context, becomes as meaningful as speech. Media researchers often point out that silence doesn't necessarily indicate guilt or involvement. It can reflect legal advice, strategic distance, or a desire to avoid amplification. Still, when silence aligns across multiple powerful figures, it raises questions about shared incentives. Another connection frequently discussed is platform influence. When stories intersect with companies that control distribution, whether streaming platforms, social media networks, or production pipelines, the boundaries of what can be shown often become clearer. Content may still be released, but framed in ways that reduce systemic exposure. This doesn't require coordination in a conspiratorial sense. It can simply reflect aligned interests, minimizing uncertainty, protecting brand stability, and avoiding unpredictable ripple effects. And finally, there is the pattern of narrative containment. Stories that initially suggest a larger framework often resolve by circling back to individual behavior. Viewers are left with answers, but not explanations. Accountability appears localized, while the broader environment remains unchanged. Taken individually, none of these patterns prove anything. But together, they form a recurring shape, one that appears whenever stories approach the intersection of power, influence, and visibility. Which brings us to the question many are now quietly asking: are these patterns accidental, or are they the natural outcome of how modern power protects itself, not through secrecy, but through structure? To understand why certain narratives stop where they do, many analysts argue that it's necessary to look beyond individuals and examine the mechanisms that quietly regulate exposure. One of the most frequently mentioned tools is the non-disclosure agreement. NDAs are standard across entertainment, technology, and media. On paper, they protect intellectual property and private business discussions. In practice, according to legal experts, they can also create long-term silence, even after relationships end or controversies surface. When multiple people connected to the same events are bound by overlapping agreements, the result isn't secrecy in the dramatic sense. It's fragmentation. Each person knows a piece, but few can speak freely about the whole. This leads to another mechanism: career vulnerability. Insiders have often noted that power in creative industries doesn't only come from money or fame, but from access to platforms, distribution, financing, and visibility. Losing that access doesn't require a public blacklist. Sometimes, it's enough for opportunities to quietly stop coming. Projects don't move forward. Calls go unanswered. Invitations disappear. According to media labor researchers, this form of pressure is rarely explicit. There's no direct threat. Instead, people are reminded, subtly, of what's at stake. The system doesn't need to punish loudly if silence is incentivized economically. Legal pressure is another recurring factor. High-profile figures often retain teams whose role isn't just defense, but deterrence. The presence of litigation risk alone can shape what journalists, platforms, and collaborators are willing to publish. Even when claims are framed cautiously, the cost of defending them can be enough to halt momentum. This is why, some argue, stories are sometimes told around certain figures rather than about them. Then there's the role of reputation management. Public relations firms, crisis consultants, and narrative strategists specialize in steering attention, not by denying stories outright, but by redirecting them. Emphasis shifts. Focus narrows. Complexity is reduced to something more digestible. Over time, audiences may feel they've seen the full picture, even if entire layers remain unexplored. Psychologists studying power dynamics point out that this creates a form of collective uncertainty. People sense that something is missing, but can't easily identify what it is. That uncertainty discourages definitive claims, and often discourages further questioning. Finally, there's self-censorship. Not all restraint comes from external pressure. Sometimes, individuals choose silence because speaking feels futile, risky, or destabilizing. When they've seen others face consequences, legal, financial, or reputational, the calculation becomes personal. Is the truth worth the cost? None of these mechanisms require a single mastermind or coordinated plan. They operate because they are embedded in how modern influence works. And when these forces align, legal, economic, psychological, they don't erase stories. They contain them. Which leads to a deeper realization: sometimes, the most powerful form of control isn't hiding information, it's shaping the limits of how far the conversation is allowed to go. At this point, the discussion stops being about any one individual. What begins to emerge instead is a pattern that feels larger, quieter, and far more difficult to define. Across multiple industries, music, film, technology, media, similar dynamics appear again and again. Certain figures become central to controversy, while others remain consistently untouched. Certain stories dominate headlines, while adjacent questions never fully surface. And when attention drifts too close to those unanswered areas, momentum often slows. This has led some observers to ask an uncomfortable question: is it possible that public scandals sometimes function as containment, rather than exposure? According to media analysts, highly visible controversies can absorb public attention so completely that they leave little space to examine surrounding structures. The focus narrows. The narrative simplifies. Responsibility appears isolated. Meanwhile, broader systems remain intact. This doesn't require coordination in the traditional sense. It relies on incentives. Platforms prioritize what's safe to publish. Legal teams calculate risk. Journalists weigh access against confrontation. Creators consider monetization and longevity. Over time, the same outcome repeats: the story feels finished, even when key pieces were never addressed. Some have pointed out that when figures from different power centers, entertainment, technology, finance, comment on the same issue using similar language, it raises questions. Not about intent, but about alignment. Why do certain boundaries appear universally understood? Why do multiple parties, with very different public personas, seem to agree on how far a conversation should go, and no further? This is where speculation intensifies, and responsible storytelling becomes essential. There is no single document, no leaked recording, no definitive proof that answers everything. What exists instead is absence. Missing segments. Unasked questions. Stories that start strong and then quietly fade. And absence, as researchers often note, can be just as informative as evidence. Because when multiple independent actors all avoid the same territory, it suggests that the cost of crossing that line is widely recognized, even if it's never publicly explained. So the real issue may not be who is being discussed. It may be who isn't. And more importantly, why the silence surrounding them remains so consistent. This is the moment where the narrative stops offering answers, and starts demanding reflection. Not conclusions. Not accusations. Just a recognition that sometimes, the most important truths in modern power structures are not hidden behind locked doors. They exist in the spaces everyone seems to agree not to enter. At this point, the discussion moves beyond individual names or isolated allegations. What stands out instead is a broader pattern, one that appears again and again across industries, platforms, and time periods. When certain stories surface, they travel fast. They dominate headlines. They spark outrage. But when those same stories approach deeper structural power, ownership, financing, data control, or institutional protection, momentum often slows. Coverage becomes cautious. Language changes. And eventually, attention shifts elsewhere. This has led many observers to question whether exposure alone is enough. Because influence doesn't always operate through visibility. In many cases, it operates through access to platforms, legal resources, media reach, and narrative framing. Those who possess this access rarely need to speak publicly. Their presence is felt in what doesn't happen rather than what does. According to media analysts, the most powerful actors are often the ones least discussed. Not because they're irrelevant, but because scrutiny itself carries consequences. Legal pressure. Business relationships. Advertising risk. Reputation management. These forces don't require direct intervention, they function quietly, shaping what is safe to publish and what is not. This is why some documentaries feel unfinished. Why certain threads are introduced but never followed. Why the same questions surface across multiple investigations, and then disappear. It doesn't necessarily mean there is a single mastermind or hidden villain. But it does suggest the existence of boundaries, lines that, once approached, trigger hesitation. And that raises the most uncomfortable question of all. If repeated patterns of silence, omission, and redirection continue to appear across unrelated cases. If multiple creators, journalists, and insiders independently describe similar limits. And if the public consistently receives stories that stop at the same point. Then what exactly defines that boundary? Is it legal risk? Economic dependency? Reputational shielding? Or something more structural, a system designed not to reveal everything, but to reveal just enough? This isn't about deciding what to believe. It's about recognizing that in stories involving immense power, absence itself can be meaningful. And sometimes, the most important part of an investigation isn't what's revealed, but what never makes it to the screen. At the end of every investigation like this, one truth remains unavoidable: no documentary, no article, and no single voice can ever show the entire picture. What we've explored here isn't about reaching a verdict. It's about noticing patterns, moments where information slows, where narratives narrow, and where certain questions quietly fade away. History shows that real power rarely announces itself. It reveals itself through restraint, through silence, and through the limits placed on what can be openly discussed. So now, the conversation shifts to you. Based on everything you've seen, the omissions, the patterns, the unanswered questions, what do you believe matters most in this story? Not who is guilty. Not who is innocent. But what was left out, and why? Your perspective is part of that story.